He was the most feared CEO in New York, until I bet he'd managed to move a woman who hated everything he represented. I just know she was the one who moved everything. Hey, my friends, before we begin this surprising story, please leave your opinion in the comments about where you're watching from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. New York City seemed suspended on that autumn night. The sky was clear, but the cold, biting air announced that winter was approaching. At the top of 432 Park Avenue, one of the most imposing buildings in the metropolis, Alexander Carter stood motionless in front of the glass windows that took up the entire wall. The soft light of the office was swallowed up by the vast darkness outside, punctuated only by the headlights of cars and the intermittent glow of the lights on Fifth Avenue in the background. Alexander held a glass of red wine between his fingers, but he did not drink. He had been there for more than 20 minutes, without saying a word, just staring at the city as if trying to remember why he had chosen all that. At 36, he was CEO of a real estate empire, respected, feared, always in control. But that night, he looked exhausted, not in body, of soul. He slowly turned his face to the side, staring at his own reflection in the glass, the tailored grey suit, the impeccable hair, the clenched jaw. Everything was in order, on the outside at least. He took a short sip of his drink and muttered softly to himself, almost as if he wanted to hear out loud the thought he had been trying to silence. Sometimes I wonder if there is anything beyond these four glass walls. The sentence hung in the air, unanswered. Like most things in his life over the past few years, Alexander couldn't remember the last time he had laughed for real, ever since he had been betrayed by his ex-fiancée, an ambitious woman who had used him to break into the luxury market and then abandoned him, taking confidential projects. To a competitor, Alexander had not allowed himself to trust anyone. Love to him was just a more sophisticated form of contract, disguised as emotion. So when the clock struck 9 p.m. sharp, he simply adjusted the cuffs of his shirt under his blazer, finished his wine in one go, and headed downstairs to the annual Corporate Culture Foundation event, one of the many social engagements he tolerated just for the sake of appearances. The ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel in the historic center of New York was impeccable. Crystal chandeliers hung from the golden ceiling, waiters circulated with silver trays, and classical music filled the empty spaces between the rehearsed conversations. Alexander moved around with the naturalness of someone who had been born there, but his eyes remained cold, calculating every movement around him. Until a voice sounded from behind with an unmistakable tone of sarcasm and friendly provocation. "Still with that funeral face, Carter. You're still the same." Alexander turned slowly, and a slight smile appeared at the corner of his mouth when he saw Mark Reynolds approaching with 2 glasses of wine in his hands. Mark had been his classmate at Columbia University, and perhaps the only one who still dared to treat him without filter. A light-hearted, ironic guy, a columnist for a business newspaper and an average investor, but with a sharp tongue. They exchanged a quick but firm handshake. "What are you doing here, Reynolds? I thought you swore you'd never set foot in an elite event again. And miss the chance to see your most expensive suit up close? No way." Mark laughed, handing him a glass. "Besides, they say you've become the loneliest man in New York. I had to come and see for myself." Alexander just arched an eyebrow, raising the glass to his lips. "And confirmed." Mark shrugged, looking around with that mocking look. "I don't know about confirming yet, but I just had an idea for a bet that might make you less bored, or more irritated, whichever comes first." Mark wasn't one to waste an opportunity when he noticed the uneasiness on Alexander's face, no matter how small. With a slight ironic smile, he took a step forward, leaned forward with a subtle gesture of his chin, and pointed to a specific spot in the hall. "Over there, near the bronze sculpture. See the one in the orange dress, with her hair tied up in the most unkempt way anyone would dare in a place like this?" Alexander followed her gaze and found the figure that stood out like a vibrant brushstroke amid the neutral palette of the guests. She was smiling with her eyes as she spoke to a waiter who seemed too nervous to handle it so naturally. The dress, simple and bold at the same time, did not follow any of the patterns of the famous designers who dressed the elite present that night. And there was something about her laughter, loud, spontaneous, effortlessly suppressed, that seemed out of place in this world of restraint and rehearsed poses. Claire Monroe, Mark continued, his voice almost conspiratorial. Street photographer, cultural activist, collaborates with a feminist collective, has written columns against the banking system, and, if I'm not mistaken, has been arrested twice for civil disobedience. He took a sip of wine and added with a mocking smile, "It's like sticking dynamite in the middle of an S&P 500 meeting." Alexander kept his gaze fixed on her, without smiling, but with a slightly pinched expression, the kind that appeared when something really intrigued him. Claire made no effort to please anyone. There was a wild honesty in her gestures, a presence too lively for that sterile room. She didn't mince words, she didn't look around before laughing, she didn't fake it. And that, which perhaps was seen as annoying by everyone around her, awakened in him a feeling he hadn't recognized for a long time: curiosity. Mark took advantage of his friend's silence to say what he had already prepared. "I bet you $500,000 that you can't turn her into the new face of the Carter Cultural Foundation in 3 months. And don't come at me with tricks, Carter. I'm talking about really convincing her. No paying, buying, forcing. She has to accept, smile in the photos, hold a glass of champagne without wanting to throw it in anyone's face. Do you think it's possible?" Alexander finally moved his lips, but what emerged wasn't a laugh or a denial. It was that crooked, silent half-smile that only appeared when a challenge began to make sense in his head. He slowly turned the wine glass in his hands, not drinking, as his eyes returned to Claire, now sitting in one of the armchairs in the back, gesturing animatedly to an older woman, clearly talking about something that mattered to her. There was fire there, and he knew fire. He'd been burned by it before. 3 months is enough time, he muttered, more to himself than to Mark. She's going to be the new face of the foundation, and contrary to what you think, she's going to accept. Mark's eyes widened for a moment, then burst out laughing. "You've completely lost your mind. That woman is the opposite of everything you stand for. She'll bite you before you even finish your proposal." But Alexander wasn't listening anymore. There was something about Claire Monroe that challenged him in a way that numbers and contracts and corporate mergers hadn't done in a long time. It was as if, for the first time in years, a real, uncontrollable variable had entered his perfectly designed equation. He walked slowly to the edge of the room, keeping his distance, but listening. He watched the way she listened to others with genuine attention, the way she interrupted with a question instead of an opinion, the way she lightly touched the other woman's arm when she laughed, a gesture of affection and ease. It wasn't a performance. Claire was there, all of her. Alexander then turned back to Mark, his face now firmer, his eyes fixed. "Deal," he said in a low but clear voice, "and it won't be with tricks. It'll be my way." Mark raised his glass and toasted the air with a mocking smile. "Then let the games begin, Carter. Just don't say I didn't warn you when she ends up being the first to tame you." The next morning, Alexander Carter walked into his penthouse with his suit still impeccable, but his gaze darker than usual. The previous night had stirred something he couldn't name, the image of Claire Monroe with her free-spirited laugh, and total lack of concern for social rules kept coming back to him more strongly than he would have liked. He had met dozens of successful, elegant women prepared for any high society event, but none of them had caused him that kind of discomfort. And it was precisely that discomfort that interested him. He sat down on the leather sofa, opened his laptop, and began typing in a few key words. In a few minutes, a small virtual folder had formed with interviews, articles, videos, and excerpts from Claire's participation in cultural groups and social projects. The more he read, the clearer it became. She wasn't just an eccentric figure. She was intelligent, articulate, with sharp opinions, and a passionate defense of American popular culture. And that could be useful. The foundation needs a more vivid image, more real, he muttered to himself, as if already justifying the plan he was about to begin. The next day, Alexander did something he rarely did. He personally called his secretary and asked her to cancel all of his afternoon meetings. He put on a light blue linen shirt and more casual slacks, and instead of a driver, he chose to drive himself. He used the address of the art collective where Claire worked as a meeting point. When he reached the narrow street in the Williamsburg neighborhood, he noticed the stark contrast between this colorful, popular scene and the sterile world of corporate offices that dominated him. He parked discreetly, got out of his car, and walked to the side door of the building, where a group of young people were painting a community mural. There she was, kneeling on the ground, holding a can of paint, her hair pulled back in a makeshift bun, wearing denim overalls stained with various colors. She laughed at something one of the girls next to her had said, her voice louder than the noise of the street. Alexander took a deep breath before approaching. This was not part of his routine, but he had already decided he would not approach her. As a businessman. Not now. "Excuse me," he said, approaching slowly. Claire turned her head with an automatic expression of impatience, as if she was expecting to hear some silly comment. But when she recognized him, she frowned. "You're the guy from the salon yesterday, aren't you? The man with the gray blazer and the look of someone who silently judges everyone." Alexander remained calm, even in the face of sarcasm. He smiled slightly. "Alexander Carter. And no, I don't judge silently. I listen first." She dropped the paint can on the floor, wiped her hands on the cloth of her overalls, and stood up. Her eyes shone with something between distrust and curiosity. "And what do you want here, Carter? This neighborhood isn't usually a meeting place for millionaire CEOs." He took a step back, respecting her space. "I want to invite you to lunch, that's all." Claire arched an eyebrow, clearly amused by the idea. "Do you usually invite women you meet by watching from afar to gala events?" Alexander answered honestly. "Only when they are so interesting that they make everything around them seem fake." For a moment, her face was serious. Then she laughed, a short, shameless laugh. "Okay, 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the corner of 34th Street. There's a place that serves the best oven-baked rice in the city. If this isn't just another social game on your part, you can come over. But I'll warn you right now, I'm terrible with masks." Alexander nodded slightly, accepting the rules of the game. "Me too." The restaurant was located on a discreet corner, with a blue tiled facade and plants hanging from the windows like living curtains. At 1:02 p.m., Alexander was already sitting at the table by the window, watching the street movement while pretending to read the recycled paper menu. The ambiance was simple, but full of soul. Walls decorated with paintings by local artists, natural light filtering through the foliage, and a spicy smell that reminded him of Sundays with his family. When Claire entered, tying her hair in an improvised bun with a pencil, he stood up, but she just smiled wryly. "Relax, Carter. No one stands up for anyone here." She sat down across from him and tossed her sunglasses on the table casually. "So, are you going to tell me why you're really here now, or are we going to talk about the weather?" Alexander rested his elbows on the table, interlaced his fingers, and looked at Claire without rushing. "I'm here because I want to make you a proposal." She let out a short laugh. "Oh, sure, here it comes." He kept his tone calm. "The Carter Foundation is about to launch a new cultural front. We want to decentralize culture, make it more accessible, more authentic, and you represent exactly that." Claire looked at him as if trying to decipher if he was serious. "You read that on a PowerPoint, did you?" Alexander smiled for the first time, looking genuinely amused. "No, that came out of my head." And yes, it works even without graphics. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her eyes fixed on his. Do you want to use my image to seem more human, more engaged? Wouldn't it be easier to donate a few million and disappear from the agenda? Her voice was not aggressive, but defiant. He didn't look away. I don't want you to represent the foundation. I want you to help build this new phase with us. Your way, with your vision. Claire was silent for a few seconds. The waiter interrupted to take their order. She ordered baked rice with cheddar cheese. He just pointed to it. And when the silence returned to the table, she finally spoke. You know what the problem is with men like you, Carter? You think authenticity can be packaged and sold, but it doesn't work that way. Alexander stood his ground. I don't think authenticity can be sold, but I do think it can be amplified. And you have something that no one else in this world of facades has. You're real. Her gaze wavered for a brief moment. Maybe because it had been a long time since anyone had said something like that so firmly. If this is an attempt at seduction disguised as social investment, I'm warning you that I'm allergic to CEOs who pretend to be philosophers. Alexander rested his chin on his hands and said in a lower voice, I don't know you well enough to want to seduce you, but I know you well enough to want to know more. She looked away for a second, took a deep breath and shook her head as if trying not to. Smile, but failing. You're not what I expected, and that bothers me more than I'd like to admit. The food arrived soon after, and the warm aroma of melted rice and cheese brought a moment of pause between them. They ate in silence for the first few minutes, just looking at each other between bites. Alexander noticed that she ate with pleasure, without rushing. Claire noticed that he cut the food with almost military precision, but his eyes were always on her. Between one sentence and another, shy laughter emerged. She told him about the project of taking photography exhibitions to public schools. He talked about the long silences in his house. And without realizing it, the conversation slipped into a more intimate territory, where the words seemed less like a game and more like an invitation. When lunch was over, Claire looked out the window, as if she needed air before making any decisions. Still seated, she twirled the silver ring on her index finger absently. You know that if I agree, half of your board will turn up their noses and the other half will try to mold me like a shop window doll. Alexander, leaning back in his chair, didn't seem bothered. I don't want a shop window doll. I want someone who bothers, who questions, who provokes. Claire gave a skeptical laugh. Do you want chaos, Carter? He looked at her with a slight smile. No, I want the truth. And sometimes the truth comes in the form of a storm. She arched an eyebrow, a little surprised by his answer. She had learned to spot men who said what was convenient, and Alexander so far seemed to really speak his mind. And most dangerously, he seemed to listen to what she said. After leaving the restaurant, they walked together for a few blocks. The afternoon sun gilded the sidewalks, and their steps were almost in sync. Neither of them seemed to want to end the moment just yet. Claire talked about the power of art in peripheral spaces, and Alexander listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was processing everything. Have you ever stepped foot in a neighborhood school that has never had an exhibition? When a child sees a picture of it on the wall, they understand that it exists, that it has value. That is more powerful than any lecture at Harvard. He paused for a moment, absorbing what had happened. That is the kind of impact I would like to fund. Not interfere, just add to it. Claire turned to him, her face serious. If you enter this world, you will have to accept that you will not have control over everything. Popular culture does not fit into spreadsheets. Alexander took a deep breath. Maybe that is exactly what I need. That phrase reverberated between the two of them as they said goodbye. Claire walked away first, saying only, I'll think about it. I'm not promising anything. Alexander watched her walk, her denim overalls still stained with paint, her steps determined. She didn't look back, but he stood still for a few minutes, feeling a knot in his stomach that he wasn't used to recognizing. It wasn't anxiety. It was something between fascination and fear. Claire was different from everyone he'd dealt with in the corporate world. She was unstable, intense, unpredictable. But maybe that was exactly what attracted him. For the first time in years, Alexander Carter felt like he'd met someone who didn't just say what she thought, but lived exactly the way she believed. And that was rarer than any cutting-edge technological innovation. That night, lying in his bed with Egyptian cotton sheets and absolute silence, he found himself smiling to himself as he remembered her clipped answers and the way she chewed her words before delivering an idea that was as accurate as a punch. Claire, on the other hand, spent the rest of the day trying to forget about lunch and failing. She painted, answered emails, discussed details of the new mural with the collective, but Alexander's face, with its unsettling calm and unexpectedly honest words, kept flashing through her mind. In the evening, as she washed her brushes in the studio sink, she quietly confessed to herself, "He's not what I thought he was." And that made her even more uncomfortable, because she knew that if she accepted, she wouldn't just be signing on to a project. She would be opening a door that had long since closed. The door that held the hope of being seen without filters. Claire no longer easily trusted anyone's intentions, but part of her wanted to believe for the first time in a long time. 3 days later, Alexander received a short message, written with her typical lack of formality. "I accept, but no suit and no nonsense." He laughed as he read it, leaning against the glass of his office overlooking the New York skyline. That same afternoon, his team was instructed to reserve the smallest, brightest meeting room, with windows overlooking an interior garden. He didn't want to impress with figures or technology. "I wanted Claire to feel comfortable being who she was." And when she arrived, wearing sneakers, ripped jeans, and a backpack, Alexander felt the right environment had been chosen. The other team members, accustomed to spreadsheets, presentations, and neutral tones, were visibly disconcerted. She entered with a casual wave and sat down at the table without asking permission. "Does anyone have any real coffee? Or are there only capsules here that cost twice as much and have no taste?" Claire listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, but her eyes were always alert, as if analyzing every expression, every pause, every slip. When Alexander finished speaking, she crossed her arms and replied, "If the idea is to put culture in the hands of those who have never had access to it, then great. But this is not going to be marketing disguised as philanthropy. If you try to soften the reality so as not to shock investors, I'll be the first to leave." The silence in the room was tense for a few seconds, until Alexander calmly intervened. "That's exactly why I called you. If someone has to remind us of this all the time, it should be you." The others still looked uncomfortable, but Claire gave a half smile. "Okay, so let's start by touching where it bothers us." The first few weeks on the job were anything but easy. Claire didn't follow protocols, criticizing presentations with terms like soulless or sounds like a bank advertisement. She sat on the floor during meetings, brought cornbread to share with employees, and made a point of talking to interns before the directors. Some executives began to question Alexander. "She doesn't fit in, Alexander. This could harm the foundation's image." But he would only respond in a firm tone. "She's the image we need, not the one that comforts." And even he, who had always controlled everything with precision, began to be affected. He found himself rethinking speeches, choosing his words more carefully. Claire wasn't always nice, but she was honest. And this honesty was like a mirror that forced him to see himself more clearly. One Friday night, Claire stopped by his office with 2 empanadas and a bottle of cheap wine. "How late are you staying here, huh? Want to eat something decent?" Alexander smiled, pushing the papers aside. She accepted without resistance, and they sat on the sofa in the waiting room, eating straight from the package and laughing at a joke about an investor who thought Bayou de Doigts was a musical style. In that, moment, Alexander realized how much she had become part of the place, not by adapting but by transforming it. And Claire, as she watched him laugh sincerely, thought quietly, maybe I'm letting myself like this. It was too early to admit it, but the feeling was there in the subtext of every exchange. The news came in a distressed phone call while Claire was still reviewing the contents of a workshop they were going to launch in the South Bronx. An old childhood friend of hers was about to be evicted with 2 young children. The building's owner, a company that was part of the Carter Holdings investment network, had tripled the rent after a facade renovation. Claire left the foundation without saying anything, caught a bus, and went straight to the neighborhood. She found her friend sitting on the sidewalk, her eyes red and her children sleeping in sleeping bags. The next morning, Claire burst into Alexander's office without warning. "This is your company," she said, slamming the dossier down on the table. "Do you know what she's doing? Do you know who she's kicking out?" He took the papers without saying a word. When he finished reading, his eyes were different. "No, I didn't know, but now I do. And I'm not going to let it go." They went together to the scene that afternoon. Alexander left his suit in the car, put on a simple shirt, and walked alongside Claire through the narrow alleys of the South Bronx. He was greeted with suspicious looks, but as soon as they saw him, listening, really listening, to the family's stories, the barriers began to fall. A woman approached with a piece of paper in her hands. "You own all this, don't you? And now you're here to see the damage?" Alexander looked at her honestly and replied, "Yes, and I'm here to fix what I let happen." Claire watched in silence, her arms crossed and her heart heavy. It wasn't common to see someone like him expose himself like that. When they walked away to talk alone, Alexander said, "I always knew. There was more to it than just the numbers, but today I felt it, and it was because of you." They spent that night together at the neighborhood community center, Claire organizing next steps with volunteers, Alexander on the phone with lawyers trying to halt the evictions. At 2 in the morning, exhausted, they shared a cold coffee and a concrete bench. "Why haven't you given up yet?" he asked, looking out at the deserted street. Claire answered without thinking much, "Because I don't know how else to do it. Because every person we save is a seed, and a seed grows into a root." He was silent for a moment. Then he murmured, "You changed me, you know?" She stared at him in surprise. "I'm still trying to figure out how." The sincerity in his eyes was so intense that Claire had to look away for a moment. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of meaning. The following week, the case gained national attention. Alexander appeared alongside Claire at a press conference, announcing the creation of a specific fund to protect social housing. The press tried to turn it into a marketing ploy, but the way he shared the spotlight with Claire made it clear that it was not. Backstage, she looked at him with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. "You know they're going to call you a gourmet socialist now, right?" He smiled, without hesitation. "I don't care, as long as people stay in their homes." Claire responded with a more restrained smile. For the first time in a long time, she trusted someone other than herself. 2 days after the press conference, when headlines were still buzzing about Carter Holdings' radical overhaul, Claire showed up at Alexander's office with an unusual invitation. "Tonight, my studio. No tie, no staff, no phone." He didn't hesitate. When he arrived, he found a rusty iron door on a barely lit street. Claire was waiting for him, in a paint-stained apron, and her hair tied up in a messy bun. "Welcome to my chaos," she said, making room for him. The space was small, but it was vibrant with color and life. Unfinished canvases leaned against the walls, paintbrushes dipped in glass cups, books piled on the floor. Old photographs were taped together, and handwritten quotes lined the walls. It was like stepping inside her mind, intense, honest, uncensored. "Every corner here has a story," Claire explained, pointing to a wall where portraits of women hung. "These are the women from my childhood. Neighbors, aunts, friends of my mother. They've all been through something. Abandonment, poverty, violence. I painted each one, trying not to forget who made me who I am. Alexander watched in silence, absorbing each stroke, each color. He stopped in front of a black and white canvas, more stark. "What about this one?" he asked. Claire hesitated for a moment, then answered, "This is my mother. The last thing I painted before she died." Her voice was firm but quiet. Alexander looked away from the canvas and back at her. "Thank you for letting me in here." Claire shrugged, but there was emotion in her eyes. "You're the first one who comes in here at night. Hardly anyone comes in during the day, to be honest." They sat on the floor, among dried paints and upturned canvases. She poured wine into a jelly glass. He accepted it without ceremony. The conversation flowed between shy laughter and silences full of meaning. "You always seem to have everything under control," Claire commented. "But when you're quiet like that, it feels like you're carrying the world on your shoulders." Alexander thought for a few seconds before answering. "Because sometimes I do, but it's only now that I realize that maybe I don't have to carry it alone." She smiled. "Well, if you need help, I have brushes and wine, and some swear words that I usually use when everything goes wrong." They both laughed, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was in this light silence that Alexander approached slowly, without haste, until he rested his forehead against hers. There were no words, no promises, just the delicate touch and the mutual recognition that something was finally being born. Later, as she closed the door behind him, Claire leaned her back against the wood and took a deep breath, her heart still pounding. It wasn't just about Alexander or that light kiss that had almost happened. It was about letting herself feel again, about letting someone see her cracks without trying to cover them up with paint. Outside, Alexander walked with his hands in his pockets, his face turned up to the New York sky. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about tomorrow's schedule or the stockholders or the numbers. All he was thinking about was her, and how this cluttered studio felt more real than any boardroom he'd ever set foot in. In the days that followed that night in the studio, Claire felt the change in the air before she could even confirm it with her own eyes. Alexander didn't show up at the foundation, nor did he send her messages as he usually did, even if they were curt and punctual. Their weekly meetings were rescheduled due to urgent commitments, and the knowing glances they shared disappeared behind the professional facade. At first, she tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just fatigue or pressure from shareholders. But as the silence stretched on, the feeling of rejection set in. "Of course," she thought to herself, pushing an unfinished canvas around the studio. "His life is about control, and I am anything but predictable." Meanwhile, Alexander buried himself in his work, using meetings as shields and deadlines as excuses. It wasn't that he didn't think about her. Quite the opposite. He thought about her too much. What they had experienced that night seemed simple, but it had affected him in a way he couldn't handle. For years, everything he had built had been based on discipline and emotional distance. With Claire, things had slipped through his fingers. "What if I can't be what she needs?" he repeated to himself. Instead of facing this doubt, he chose the most familiar path, distancing himself. Only this time, silence didn't bring relief. It brought longing. At the foundation, Claire began to retreat as well. She cancelled meetings, stopped leading projects. She spent hours locked in her studio, as if the chaos of painting could fill the void Alexander had left. She didn't say anything to anyone, but the employees noticed. "Is everything okay?" asked Marta, one of the coordinators. Claire gave a wry smile. "I'm just recalculating the routes." But inside, she hurt, not so much because of the withdrawal itself, but because of his cowardice in not explaining, not confronting her. One afternoon, she passed by Carter Tower. She looked at the imposing, perfect glass and steel building and turned away without going inside. "If he wants to talk to me, he knows where to find me." What Claire didn't know was that very afternoon Alexander was at the top of the tower, looking out over New York as if searching for answers on the horizon. In his hands, he held a folder. Inside it, the outline of a project she herself had suggested, a cultural center in the South Bronx, created from the Housing Fund. It was the Foundation's most symbolic project since its inception, and yet he couldn't present it without thinking about her. Finally, he picked up the phone. He called. "Claire, can we talk?" On the other end, there was silence for a few seconds. Then her voice, firm and straightforward. "It depends. Are you going to run away again, or are you going to have the courage to talk to me like a human being?" Alexander took a deep breath. "I will." And so, for the first time, he didn't run away from what he felt. The reunion took place in the studio, as if the cycle needed to close where it had begun. Alexander arrived before the agreed time. He was nervous, but he didn't let it show. He carried an envelope with him, not as an offering or an apology, but as part of what needed to be said. Claire opened the door with her hair tied up haphazardly and a paintbrush still in her hand. She didn't smile, didn't invite him in right away. She just said, "Speak." Alexander took a deep breath. "I walked away because I was afraid. Afraid of you, of me with you, of everything that this feeling can dismantle." She looked at him for a moment, then turned her back and went inside. "Then come in, since you decided not to run away." The space was more chaotic than before. Canvases were leaning against each other, fabrics hanging, music playing on a loop from a speaker. Alexander walked slowly, as if each step required effort. "I can't deal with what I can't control. And you dismantle me, with your way, with your truth, with what you show me about myself." Claire put the paintbrush down on a table and crossed her arms. "You didn't have to run away. You just had to say that." He nodded, looking at the floor. "I know, and that's why I'm here." He held out the envelope. "It's the project, the cultural center you envisioned. It's going to happen, in your name, with your leadership." She took the envelope, leafed through it quickly, and said nothing for several seconds. Then she dropped it on the table and said, "Do you think this buys me?" "No," he replied firmly. "That's just part of it. What I want to tell you doesn't fit into contracts or excuses." Alexander moved closer, but without invading her space. "You made me rethink everything. And when I tried to go back to the life I knew, it no longer made sense. I thought I needed to maintain control, but what I really need is truth. And your truth gives me fear and peace at the same time." Claire lowered her gaze. When she spoke, her voice was lower. "And I'm afraid too, of liking someone who lives surrounded by glass walls, who could leave at any moment." Alexander extended his hand without touching hers. "This time, I'm not going anywhere." Claire looked at that outstretched hand as if it were a dangerous invitation. For a moment, her old impulsiveness wanted to push her away, but there was something in Alexander's gaze, something naked, imperfect, true. She took a step forward, placing her fingers over his delicately, as if testing the temperature of water before diving in. "If I'm going to trust again, it has to be with everything, with fear and with hope, because I don't know how to love halfway." Alexander smiled, a small, almost sad smile, as if he understood the weight of the choice. "Then let's go together, with everything." And there, among dirty brushes, hanging canvases, and the low music that still echoed from the back of the studio, the two embraced for the first time without defenses, without masks, and without haste. From that night in the studio onward, Claire and Alexander began a quiet rebuilding. There were no daily declarations or grandiose promises, but there was a presence. Alexander began to visit her, unannounced. Sometimes he brought coffee, other times he just brought the silence of someone who didn't need to be anything other than himself. Claire, for her part, no longer held back. She let him in, let him see her unfinished canvases, and gradually let him see the parts of her she had always tried to hide. The foundation staff noticed the change. Alexander smiled more, appeared less in suits and more in shirts rolled up to the elbows. Claire was once again coordinating projects with energy, and the sparkle in her eyes, that particular sparkle she had when she spoke passionately, was back. One morning, he drove her to the South Bronx, where the new cultural center was to be located. The old exposed brick building had been an abandoned school. Now, with the help of the Carter Fund, it would be transformed into a space for art, education, and shelter. Claire walked through the hallways with tears in her eyes. I went to school in a place like this. I remember the sound of the lunch, the creaking of the chairs, the teacher clapping her hands for us to sit in a circle. Alexander watched her, saying nothing. Only after she had finished the walk did he speak in a low voice. That's why your name has to be on the entrance, because you carry this story with you. She smiled. Only if yours comes next to it, because you were the one who reminded me that it's worth believing again. At the reopening, the cultural center was packed. Children ran through the hallways with paint. In their hands, women from the community displayed their embroidery. A theater group rehearsed in the courtyard, and on the improvised stage, Claire gave a brief but striking speech. This place is made of memories, and also of futures. Here, no one is invisible. When Alexander stepped up shortly thereafter, he didn't speak as CEO. He spoke as one who had also been transformed. Meeting Claire made me look beyond the reports. It made me see people again. The audience applauded, enthusiastically, but the exchange of glances between the two was what really sealed that moment. There, they were whole. That night, as they lay in the hammock Claire had strung between two columns in the studio, they laughed like teenagers. If someone had told you 6 months ago that the rebel from Williamsburg would be with the glass prince of Carter Tower, I would have called them crazy, Claire joked, running her fingers through his hair. Alexander laughed, pulling her closer. And if someone had told you that the glass prince would learn to like paint on the floor and wine in a jelly glass, I would have signed off on that. The silence that followed was comfortable. Neither of them was in a hurry. They had found something rare, a love built on real shards, not perfect promises. 2 years have passed since the night of the speech in the South Bronx, and a lot has changed, including Alexander. It's not that he was any less of a pragmatist and straightforward man than before, but there was something different about the way he would walk into the studio with paint-stained shirt sleeves, or the way he would get emotional when he heard a woman tell the story of the embroidery she had done for the new gallery. The Carter Foundation has grown, and so has the reach of the cultural center, which has become a reference for community art and social inclusion. But most notably, the name Claire has come to be synonymous with more than just an artist. It has become a symbol of resilience, empathy, and new beginnings. In the small house in Williamsburg, where it all began, there were now toys scattered on the porch, clay pots with names written in colored chalk, and a hammock in the backyard where Alexander still lay with Claire after long days. But there was also something new, a rocking chair and a wall freshly painted with flowers made by little hands. When asked how they managed to balance so much, work, community, love, Claire always said the same thing with a calm smile. We allow ourselves to make mistakes, and we try again, together. It was simple, but it worked, because they both understood that love was not a formula, it was a process, and that the pieces they carried helped them build something that neither of them could have achieved alone. One autumn afternoon, Alexander appeared in the studio with a vase of white daisies, Claire's favorite flowers. She greeted him with a paint-stained apron and a baby in her arms. "The little lady has been waiting for you since morning," he said, handing his daughter into his arms. The girl had her father's gray eyes and her mother's brown curls. Alexander held her carefully, murmuring, "Hola, Sophia." It was the name Claire had chosen in honor of her grandmother. And at that moment, Claire realized that there was the true masterpiece of their lives. That unexpected family, sewn together with patience, courage, and affection. On the wall of the cultural center, under the main entrance, a phrase was engraved months after the inauguration. It wasn't signed by anyone, but everyone knew where it came from. The strongest roots grow in the hardest soil, and there, amidst children running and stories being told, Alexander and Claire walked side by side. No rush, no script, just living and dancing as she said, "The way the heart tells you, even when the music fails a little." Because now, finally, they knew they had each other, and that was enough. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel, leave a like and activate notifications so you don't miss future content. See you later.